The first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the evidences proposed by the evolutionist. And what we'll basically be doing is we'll be looking at high school textbooks that are published, in specific the high school textbooks that's here in Texas, but they're all similar. And we're going to be going through every one of the quote-unquote proofs for evolution in those books and showing why they're not really proofs, okay? That's the first thing we'll do. And it'll be things such as homology and the fossil record and looking at the Miller experiment, Miller-Urey experiment, all those things. That'll take up quite a bit of our classes. After that, we'll be looking at proofs, if you will, that are given to deny evolution. And we'll be looking at things like Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box, that looks at irreducible complexity. Spend a little bit of time on that. We'll be looking at the laws of thermodynamics, how they disprove or make evolution very unlikely. We'll also be looking at the Cambrian explosion and looking at what that means. You may have heard that expression before. We'll spend a little bit of time on that and how the Cambrian explosion makes evolution very, very unlikely and the evidence behind that. And then we'll finish up with the intelligent design community and the work that they're doing, especially William Dembski. And for that, we'll be looking at information theory and the probabilities, and show what the probabilities are of evolution ever occurring, for that matter creation as well. And then the final thing we'll look at in the class, we'll be looking at new theories of evolution, or at least new mechanisms of evolution, because more and more evolutionists are understanding that the present state is getting harder and harder to deny. So they don't want to deny that evolution occurred, they just want to deny there's another mechanism for it. And we'll look at those briefly because there's a bunch of them out there. They're all kind of a variation on a theme, to be honest with you, which has to involve, at least to some degree, the idea of punctuated evolution. Evolution had to occur in quicker spurts, if you will, than Darwin proposed. So for today, we're going to be looking at the finishing up on the historical stuff. We talked about Darwin and his trip on the Beagle around the world, and then finally where he came to the Galapagos Islands, and then many years later, he began work on his book, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection in 1837. Finished it in 1859, primarily finished it, he had been working on it a long time, he still wasn't ready to publish it, so he published it as a manuscript, quote unquote, that's what he called it, because there was competition coming. Russell Wallace was on the same line, or had developed the same line of thought about evolution and natural selection, so Darwin got his out there pretty quick as a result of that, many years after the voyage, of course. And it did literally change the world. And we'll talk about that a little bit more both today and next week. But it changed the way scientists and eventually all of mankind began looking at mankind and creating doubts, if you will, about what the Bible said. And so it really was a change in the way man looked at ourselves. Well, what was his evolution? What was his theory, and what did it entail? First of all, the first thing it needed to be successful was gradualism. Okay, things had to occur gradually over time, not sudden leaps. Darwin did not believe in sudden leaps. And so it had to entail a lot of time. And we talked about the uniformitarian concept that Charles Lyell had proposed, and how Darwin had read that book, and it influenced him greatly, and it required that, and without that, I don't know if Darwin would have ever come up with his theory. So things had to occur gradually, not in sudden leaps, for evolution to occur, according to Darwin. And so as a result, it required a lot of time. And we'll be looking at the idea of time in this class later on, and how old the world is and that sort of thing. We're not going to get into that right this minute, but along the same about time frame that Charles Lyell was alive and Darwin was alive, and actually even just before that, the idea of the geologic column came into play. And these were geologists that looked at the fossil records and established the geologic column. Now, the geologic column was not established by evolutionists, like some people want to say. That's not how the geologic column was founded. It was founded before Darwin published his book, so it wouldn't even have made sense. But they looked at the geologic column and they said, well, there was a lot of time, and so time became real important for Darwin and for evolution to occur. So with enough time and enough, and the concept of gradualism, evolution could occur. The graph on your screen is Darwin's tree. We won't spend a lot of time there either, but as you can see in Darwin's tree of life, it's been referred to, at the very bottom you have one organism. That one organism eventually branches off into multi-organisms. Then you got plant life, you got animal life, so on and so forth. Of course, it's a fallacy, but that's in his textbook, Origin on the Species. Well, how did evolution occur? The basic mechanism for evolution to occur, according to Darwin, was natural selection. Well, what is natural selection? Now, the term survival of the fittest and natural selection are synonymous, basically. But the word survival of the fittest was not coined by Darwin. It was coined by Herbert Spencer a few years later, 1864, when he read Origin of Species. And Spencer was more of an economist, okay? And this survival of the fittest he had originally applied to a theory on economy. He brought that into evolution. But it means basically the same thing. Natural selection. Through natural selection, species could change. Well, what Darwin did is Darwin looked at domesticated animals. He looked at farm animals, he looked at dogs, cats, things like that. And breeders in that day, and still do for that matter, could cause variation to occur in cattle and animals and horses and things of that nature. And they did that purposely. So you would call that sort of unnatural selection, if you will. That was what man did to try to breed bigger cattle, better sheep, that sort of thing. And what he did is he applied that to the natural world. He said, well, if man can do that, nature can do that as well. And nature can select naturally those organisms that would be most beneficial. And as a result, the organisms that would not be most beneficial would sort of die out depending on the geography of where those animals were at. And so the nature would then naturally select those species that could survive. And that makes sense, doesn't it, really? And I don't know of too many people that really doubt natural selection per se, or survival of the fittest. The fittest animals are going to survive. I mean, can you deny that? No. But he applied that to a change in the species, where a species became another species, and we've talked about that word, what species means, and we'll spend more time on that as well. But that's how he came up with the idea of evolution, through natural selection. And so as a result, it was summarized by Jacques Monod, and he says that chance alone is at the source of every innovation of all creation in the biosphere. Pure chance, absolutely free but blind, at the very root of the stupendous edifice of evolution. And this is what Monod said about Darwin's theory, and I think it kind of summarizes that theory. One theory, and we'll look at this again later as well, that I have, or one question I have about that would be why? Why would life begin to begin with? What's the purpose? Just by chance, obviously, is what the theorists say. But that kind of summarizes what Darwin believed. Now, Darwin actually had in his book, if you look at it closely, two different types of theories. And Michael Denton, in his book, Evolution of Theory in Crisis, puts these in two broad categories. And he calls one the special theory. It's kind of like Einstein's special theory of relativity and his general theory of relativity. Well, this is, in Denton words, a special theory and a general theory of evolution. And the special theory was that new species arise in nature by the agency of natural selection. Now, Darwin didn't have a mechanism yet. He had an agency, but he didn't have an engine. We'll talk about that later today. But it occurred through natural selection. That was his special theory. But Darwin also thought that his theory, his special theory, applied to the appearance of life, okay? And that would be what you might call his general theory. So the special theory is species change through the process of natural selection, but you broadly apply that and life begins. And that becomes his general theory. So general theory was a lot more controversial, obviously. In fact, Denton says if the origin had dealt only with the evolution of new species, it would never have had its revolutionary impact. And I think that's true. especially if we understand how to define the word species, because species do change. And I don't believe anyone in this room believes that species don't change. If you do, talk to me about it after the class. But species do change. Now, you can argue whether they change into another species, but then you get into the definition of what the word species means. And we'll, as I say, talk about that later. So that was not terribly controversial. It would have created a little bit of controversy, but when he added the general theory in his book, that's where the big controversy was. Now, Darwin never was dogmatic about the general theory. Okay, he was really not dogmatic about it, and he says he never claimed that his book really tried to explain the origins of life. But if you look at a quote from his book, oh, excuse me, I haven't got there yet. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but what were the other evidences to Darwin that evolution had occurred? What made him come up with this idea of natural selection to begin with? The first thing he looked at was something called homology. And homology is just looking at the similarities of species and things that species all had in common. And that may not show up real well, but the idea that the arm of a human, the leg of a cat, the flipper of a whale, the wing of the bat, all had bones that were similar, but had different function, obviously. The arm of a man did something similar, obviously, than what the leg of a cat did and so forth. And this is the front leg of the cat, by the way. It doesn't necessarily apply to the back leg as much. The wing of a bat. So he looked at that sort of things. Not just the idea that, for example, his finches had different beaks, and his theory of evolution didn't really come from those finches. He observed those, but he was looking more broadly at that. And he said there were similarities within species, and that it would be hard to deny that they weren't similar. And I would agree to that, but that doesn't prove evolution necessarily. Their similarity, we all share DNA. Doesn't produce, all life shares DNA as well. Doesn't produce evolution necessarily, and doesn't prove evolution, but that was probably his biggest reason for coming up with evolution, was the idea of homology. And so we'll spend some time looking at homology, and does homology really prove or disprove evolution? But it was real important to Darwin in his theory was the concept of homology. And like I say, we'll spend a lot more time on that. Then the other idea that Darwin looked at was the concept of rudimentary organs. We might use the word vestigial organs. That was coined later after Darwin. Well, what's the idea of rudimentary organs or vestigial organs? Well, as organisms, species develop, things that they might have needed in their past, they don't need anymore. And that was proof of evolution, these rudimentary organs. And at the time that Darwin wrote his book, there was literally hundreds and hundreds of them in his idea, in his mind. And a few examples would be the earlobe, your coccyx. In this picture, we've got the appendix. The appendix was considered a rudimentary organ that no longer needed to be there. It was left over from prior development that other animals needed an organ similar to that, and there was many of those. And that was also proof, because why were those organs in our body or in the body of other animals? Well, they were quote unquote rudimentary. They were left over. And so this was proof. We'll look at that as well and see, first of all, are these organs rudimentary? As time's gone on, we've seen that they actually do have a lot of function. The appendix, for example, plays an important role in fighting off bacteria and other infections, and has other roles as well that they didn't understand at the time. And as science has gone further and further along, we understand there are no rudimentary organs in our body. They have a purpose. So these were the two bases that he came up with his theory, homology and rudimentary organs. So again, I mentioned earlier that Darwin was not really dogmatic about his belief on the origin of life, and he said his theory didn't necessarily explain it, but he throws this in his book. I'm going to read this. It's a little lengthy, but I want to read it because this comes straight from On the Origin of Species. And the grammar is a little bit different, but this is the way it's literally written. It is often said that all the conditions for the first production of a living organism are present which could ever have been present. Again, idea of uniformitarianism. But if we could conceive in some warm pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity present, that a protein was formed ready to undergo still more complex changes at the present day, such matter be instantly devoured or absorbed, which would not have been the case before living creatures were formed. What he's basically saying, that protein would have survived, the protein then would have become life. And so he really did believe that the origin of life came from inorganic material, and that all animals, all life for that matter, had a single origin. He might not have been as dogmatic about it as people are today, but he certainly did believe that. And that's his general theory. Now, his theory caused, as we say, controversy immediately, especially within the Christian community and the church community, and people were in uproar over it all. Even his own wife was upset about it. She was a devout Christian. As we said, Darwin himself was trained as a theologian at Cambridge, and he was a Christian, and he held Christian views before his book, before he published his book. But later on in life, this is what he wrote to his wife. He says, "When I'm dead, know that many times I've kissed and cried over this his theory of evolution and the problem it caused with his wife. Not only his wife, but the whole world." In fact, in your paper, I mentioned that even the captain of the Beagle, Captain Fitzroy, later committed suicide over the book Origin of Species because of what it did to the community, and he felt responsible because he was responsible for taking Darwin on this voyage. Now, if Darwin hadn't written The Origin of the Species, would we have the theory of evolution? Of course we would have. I mean, like we already mentioned, Russell Wallace was already headed that direction, and other people were headed that direction, but he was kind of the first to come aboard, and his book was written, and it does have a certain amount of eloquence to it when you read it, but the theory would have still come about. But needless to say, it changed the world. Now, Darwin had some doubts about his theory, not doubts about his theory, but he understood that there was problems scientifically with his theory. And the biggest problem he had was in the fossil record. And so this is from Origin of Species as well. Darwin's doubt, lack of fossil evidence. And he states the distinctness of specific forms and they're not being blended together by innumerable transitional links is a very obvious difficulty. And you know what? It is still a very obvious difficulty despite what your textbooks say. Now, Darwin had an idea of why it was difficult. His thought primarily was they just haven't discovered enough of them yet. Given enough time, given enough time, they would find those transitional forms. And he understood that the world at that time had not really discovered that many fossils and hadn't unearthed enough fossils. And he believed that when they did, that his theory would be proven. We still don't see those transitional forms again, but it is a very serious problem with him. Duane Gish years ago, how many have ever read Duane Gish's The Fossils Say No? Anybody here? It was published in the mid-70s, I believe. A brilliant guy, and I read that, one of the first books I read that was on evolution and anti-evolution, and he showed very thoroughly that the fossil record just didn't support evolution, and it still doesn't. Duane Gish died at 92 last year, by the way, and he did many debates on evolution. His method of debate became popular with the evolutionists. It was known as Gish's chop. His technique, anyway, interesting thing. But the fossil records still don't prove evolution, and Darwin realized there was a problem at that time. So we mentioned this already, but Darwin did not believe in saltationalism. And what is saltationalism? Well, again, as the diagram shows, it's the idea of a species becoming another species. In this case, I guess that's some sort of mammal that eventually became a reptile, and you can reverse that if you want to, it doesn't matter. But he clearly did not believe that. He said everything had to come on gradually, no sudden leaps, and there's no evidence that sudden leaps occur either. So Darwinism implied then an end to traditional theologic and anthropologic thought, and those at the time knew that. They realized that what Darwin was saying, that man was no longer the pinnacle of creation, but man, just like all the other animals and life, was just a cosmic accident. and we were purely put here by random processes. And you can see how that would change things and how it has changed things. Thomas Huxley, who was referred to again as Darwin's bulldog, he realized there was no compromise between science and religion if evolution be true. Now, since that time, people have tried to make that compromise. Theistic evolutionists and other progressive evolutionists, all other type of theories are out there to try to blend science with the Bible. But Huxley understood that there really wasn't any blending. What our friend Richard Dawkins said about that is Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. You could be an atheist before Origin of Species, but now you could be intellectually fulfilled because now you had a reason to remain an atheist. And I mentioned Dawkins himself said that he became an atheist when he became a full believing evolutionist. And Michael Denton, in his book, once again, understands the importance of evolutionary theory, and I think we all in this class do as well. But Denton, this is one step ahead of myself. This is also a quote from Richard Dawkins from his book, The Blind Watchmaker. He said, "It is absolutely safe to say, if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that." So he and many scientists are fully convinced now this is the only method that life began. And again, Michael Denton understands the importance of evolutionary thought. And I thought his quotes in his book are important, so I want to read these. He says, "Chance and design are antithetical concepts, and the decline in religious belief can probably be attributed more to the propagation and advocacy by the intellectual and scientific community of the Darwinian version of evolution than any other single factor." And I believe there's a lot of truth to that. I think the decline in religion as a whole throughout the world, and I do believe there's been a decline since the time of Darwin, and I think his theory was very much responsible for it to a great extent, more than anything else. And then Denton also says, "It was because Darwinian theory broke man's link with God and set him adrift in a cosmos without purpose or end that its impact was so fundamental. No other intellectual revolution in modern times, with the possible exception of the Copernican, so profoundly affected the way man viewed themselves in their place in the universe." So what's the current state? What's the current state of evolution now? We're going to look at that, and we're going to look at that in some detail. And I really believe possibly this lesson is maybe the most important lesson of this class. I really do. And you may think I've taken it backwards a little bit. Maybe this lesson should have been at the end of our study. But I've put it at first. When you read textbooks, especially by Stephen Meyer and Denton and other people, they put a lot of this at the end. And I put it at the beginning because I want to address the issue at the beginning. And I think that'll help you when you get to the end. Because like I've said repeatedly, we're going to show the probability of evolution to be so minuscule that it takes more faith to be an evolutionist than it does to be a Christian. And I really strongly believe that. But I want to address the issue as to why scientists still hold to evolution. Because if I'm a student in a class, whether it be high school or whether it be college, and I'm repeatedly told that you've got to be an idiot or stupid or crazy or a fanatic not to believe in evolution because everybody else believes it, why is that? And we're going to look at that in some detail. But as soon as the book was written, scientists began to tear it apart. Not everybody accepted it, especially a lot of the zoologists and biologists. They understood there was a problem with his book because there was no mechanism. Natural selection requires that there be an organism there to begin with, doesn't it? I mean, if you're going to naturally select something, how do two molecules come together to begin with? Not only that, but nobody had ever witnessed any change in species where an animal, let's make it real big, a big leap. Let's say a fish became a mammal. I mean, nobody's ever witnessed that or any transition to that. And there was no mechanism for it. Darwin didn't have a mechanism for evolution. All he had was natural selection. And then we notice Herbert Spencer used the term survival of the fittest. At the time, Darwin thought that was actually a better term and he used it in his 5th edition of his book. Now, evolutionists don't like the term survival of the fittest. They don't like that. They say it's not scientific enough. But needless to say, they are interchangeable. Darwin knew nothing about genetics, even though Gregor Mendel, the father of modern genetics, was a contemporary with him. From what we can understand, at least. He apparently didn't know very much about genetics. He could have, because Mendel was publishing his work, but in Darwin's defense, a lot of people at the time ignored Mendel, that he wasn't very well known. It's been in the last century or so that Mendel really, we understood how important his work was. What Mendel did is he said acquired inheritance was incorrect. Darwin believed in the idea of acquired inheritance. What does that mean? Well, it means basically if you worked out strong and you built up your muscles and you became a muscle-bound guy, then your children would be born with that capability also now, becoming big muscles. In other words, if you inherited something, you could, if you acquired something, you could pass that on to your progeny, to your children. Well, Mendel came along with his looking at peas and plants in particular, and he said, no, acquired characteristics are incorrect. You can't pass those along. He also disproved the concept of blending, and blending is the concept. Like, I'll make it kind of goofy a little bit. Let's say you got blue eyes and brown eyes, and you blend those together, and you get green eyes. See, that was the idea of genetics back then, that the characteristics you got from your mother and your father could be blended together, and that's how you got different colors of eyes, different colors of hair, so on and so forth. That's an incorrect concept. That's not how genetics works. But that was what was believed until Mendel showed that it didn't occur that way. So because of these ideas and because of these concepts that Mendel came up with and showed to be true, it put limitations on the genetic variability available for natural selection. So scientists started saying there's a problem here. Okay, there's a problem here. Evolution has some restrictions. So NeoDarwinism then came into play. And NeoDarwinism understood now or started looking at the idea of mutations. So whenever you see the word NeoDarwinism, what you're looking at there is the idea now that's Darwin plus mutations, because Darwin never mentioned mutations in his book. He didn't understand mutations could cause change, or didn't realize it could cause change. And so what the neo-Darwinist says is microevolutionary changes can accumulate to produce macroevolution through mutations and natural selection. So now natural selection had its engine, so to speak. Now you've got a mechanism for natural selection to occur. Now it still doesn't explain that beginning of life. That's still a big, big problem. And even your high school textbooks say that. But it did try to explain at least how variation could occur, and to the point where microevolution could become macroevolution. I don't particularly like those terms. We will use them sometimes in this class, microevolution and macroevolution. Just microevolution is change within the species, which again I think we all would say is not wrong. I just don't like the word evolutionary, because it's not evolutionary, it's adaptation. Species adapt. So I will try to use the word more consistently and use the word adaptation instead of microevolution. Macroevolution is what we're talking about in this class and what we're trying to disprove. And that's the concept that species can make big leaps and can become different species, or different kinds, if you will. And I'll also try to avoid the word species sometimes and use more the word kinds. But neo-Darwinism then brings in mutations. And neo-Darwinism had its big kick when James Watson and Francis Crick discovered the structure of the DNA molecule in 1953, interestingly the same year I was born. So Crick postulated a sequence hypothesis when they discovered it. They realized what they had when they discovered what DNA was. And the sequence hypothesis was that when you line up these nucleotides in a certain order, then you get a certain characteristic and produces the color of your hair, the color of your eyes, what would form in your body. That was the sequence hypothesis. It was just a hypothesis when Crick made that statement half a century ago. It's been proven now. That's how DNA works. It is through the sequence hypothesis. And now evolutionists had a field day because they could say, okay, you have changes in those sequences and you can change the characteristics of the organism, and evolution can occur when mutations occur in those sequences. And indeed, when there are changes in those sequences of those nucleotides, you do have a change in the characteristic of the organism. And we know mutations occur. Nobody's doubting mutations occur. We'll spend some time on that. But every mutation I have ever seen is it's a non-beneficial mutation. Every mutation I've ever seen or witnessed, they have to be micro changes that you really can hardly see. And again, for Neo-Darwinism to occur, just like Darwin, it required millions and millions of years. Current state, and you can Google this, and I've Googled it, and it changes from time to time, but as far as who believes in evolution, roughly about half the population believe at least in some form of evolution. I think a lot of those people don't understand exactly what they believe. They just throw the word evolution out there, and we know from this class that the word evolution can mean different things, whether it be adaptation for me, microevolution for others, or macroevolution for those who believe in changing kind. But about half the population believe it, so in the United States. So it's well accepted. A lot of those are theistic and so forth, theistic evolutionists, if you will, but a lot of people do continue to accept the concept of evolution. Doesn't mean it's right. I'll spend quite a bit of time on that. Doesn't mean it's right. Years ago, a fellow by the name of Bolton Davidheiser, this is an old book, I don't know if you can even find it in print, it's called Evolution and Christian Faith. He proposed in the very, very beginning of that book, there was 3 different classes of people who accept evolution. And I think it still holds today, those classes. One class is the people, and this is the beginning of your third handout, class 3. And one class are those class of people that are really out there to destroy Christianity. That's what they want to do, or they want to destroy religion, not just Christianity, but Christianity in particular. But they're really out there to destroy it, to destroy religion. And in some cases, that's literally their stated goal. That's literally their stated goal. And these are, if you want to use the word, hardcore. And they are postmodernist. And if you understand, remember what we said last week about the postmodernist. What is truth to the postmodernist? Yeah, it's relative. It's all relative. So it's hard to take a lot of what they say because you understand that these people are postmodernists, but they're really out to get rid of revolution, get rid of religion through the teaching of evolution and the acceptance of evolution. I don't know why. You know, I don't know why these people are so dogmatic and so aggressive, and in some cases just plain mean-spirited. No, to me, their atheistic thought is more a religion than most Christians have. They're so passionate about it, and I go, why? I mean, you can believe what you want to believe, and I understand that, but why be so mean-spirited about it? And one group that heads this up is the National Center for the Scientific Education, NCSE, and I believe it's still headed by a lady by the name of Eugenie Scott. When we see at the very end of our class, we're going to show a video called Expelled, and she will be in that video, and we'll get to meet her. But she is passionate about her evolution, and her idea is to get evolution out of the classroom by any means that she feels appropriate to do it. Now, at the beginning, Eugenie Scott, it was really about the science. Let's get into the science and let's teach the science and pound the science and so forth. And we're going to change our country, and we're going to change the way science is taught. And of course, now it is pretty much that way. The only thing taught in schools now is really evolution. But she realized she was having some trouble, so she brought in on occasion the American Civil Liberties Union. And if anybody would think would allow intelligent design to be taught in class, you would think it'd be somebody called the American Civil Liberties Union, wouldn't you? I mean, I would, but if you know these people, you know that's not true. But civil liberties, shouldn't we have the liberty of teaching creation in the classroom? No, they go after that. And so when the NCS has problems, they call them the ACL, and they get involved. And when I'm talking about problems, I'm talking about when creation is tried to be taught in the classroom. When someone attempts to bring creation in the classroom, whether it be a change in the textbooks, which a lot of the people we talk about in this class are trying to do, like Stephen Meyer and Dembski and Ken Ham and these other guys trying to get creation put back in the textbooks, or whether it's a rogue teacher, if you will, a teacher that takes it upon him or herself to teach creation in the class. ACL has actually sued individual teachers, and they've certainly sued school boards on the state level and even at the local level to get creation taken out of the textbooks. And unfortunately, so far, they've been very successful in that. And you won't see, and I'll give you kind of a preview of what we'll be talking about. You won't see creation mentioned in our Texas textbook on biology. These people have been very successful. Again, I just don't understand why they have to be so mean-spirited about it, but they are. But Eugenie Scott realized that what her techniques weren't really working amongst the general population as well as she would like and her organization would like. So they started looking at a different tactic, and Ken Ham talks about this in one of his books. I don't remember if it's book 2 or 3, but in his New Genesis book, and he talks about her new tactics. So she's going after the religious community. And so they established this adult religious project. And that project was to focus on evolution with religious leaders. Because if we can get the head of religious organizations to accept evolution, then everybody else then goes, oh, well, brother so-and-so believes it, or pastor so-and-so believes it, or whatever. You understand what I'm saying? But if I can get a religious leader to accept evolution, then that gives me good reason now that I can accept it, and I can try to blend it in my religion in some way or the other. Because they don't give up their religion. They just want to bring evolution into it. And Eugenie Scott understood that. So this project was to encourage religious leaders to support the Clergy Letter Project, and that's actually the name of the project, the Clergy Letter Project, and to participate in evolution education. They would hold seminars. They would hold special Sundays or special Saturdays where they would go in and try to teach evolution to religious leaders. Now, don't get this wrong. Eugenie Scott is not pro-religion in any way, form at all. Neither is the ACL. But they just understand to get evolution into the churches, they have to get the religious leaders on board and try to show them that they don't have to give up their quote-unquote spirituality to be an evolutionist. That's their whole goal. But that's their tactic. So they encourage leaders to produce educational resources about evolution and education and to stand for evolution education. Get the clergy, get the religious community behind them.